Every once in a while, maybe every couple of years, I would say, something like that, I try to go back to the book of Proverbs and just select proverbs that remind us of some of the great things, great ideas of human relationships, our relationship to God, and the wise sayings of people. Just about every country, just about every culture has its wise sayings. Things that are said become proverbial for us. This was especially true in the ancient days among the Middle Eastern people. The Middle Eastern countries today put a great deal of confidence in the proverbs that have been handed down from generation to generation. And of course, in the Bible, we have the book of Proverbs, and then we have the book of Ecclesiastes, the book of Job, the book of Psalms, the book of Song of Solomon. All of these are referred to generally as the wisdom literature of the Old Testament. A couple of things that we need to keep in mind before we take a look at a few of these proverbs. First of all, proverbs, in the very nature of things, proverbs are not absolute rules. They don't have an absolute product that they produce. My couple of favorites along this line are a soft answer turns away wrath, but grievous words stir up anger. Let me tell you, folks, that's not always true. That is a generalization that says basically this is the way life works. But these are not absolutes. And it doesn't mean every time you get into a squabble with somebody, you give them a soft answer and that smooths things out. Sometimes it does and sometimes it doesn't, but it's a good rule to follow. That's the idea. Another that I think of is train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. Well, sometimes they do. Children have, as they grow up, they have their own minds, they have their own situations, and so generally speaking, proverbs are good ideas, workable ideas that usually work in life, but they are not to be thought of as absolutes or like the commandment "Thou shalt not kill" is "Thou shalt not steal." Those are a little bit different than proverbs. That's not a proverbial saying. That's a commandment. So what I want to do this evening is to go to the book of Ecclesiastes and choose some proverbs or some ideas there in that book, which will tell us something about the way life works. And then we'll go back to the book of Proverbs itself, and we'll take a look at some of the things that are in that book. Kind of as an introductory text, though, I would like to read from the book of Proverbs, chapter 1, verses 1 through 7. The Proverbs of Solomon, the son of David, the king of Israel. For attaining wisdom and discipline, for understanding words of insight, for acquiring a disciplined and prudent life, doing what is right and just and fair, for giving prudence to the simple, knowledge to the discerning, to the young, knowledge and discretion to the young. Let the wise listen and add to their learning, and let the discerning get guidance. For understanding proverbs and parables, the sayings and riddles of the wise. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and discipline. That's kind of an introductory paragraph to this book of Proverbs. It mentions the Proverbs of Solomon. As we move along in the book of Proverbs, we find out that there are a number of other men who also wrote some of the Proverbs that are contained in that book. Now I want to go back to the book of Ecclesiastes, to the 3rd chapter. This is just a beautiful statement about time that the writer here gives us. I want to read this, and then we'll just make an observation or two along the line. There is a time for everything, and a season for every activity under heaven. a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to uproot, a time to kill, a time to heal, a time to tear down, a time to build, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to scatter stones and a time to gather them, a time to embrace and a time to refrain, a time to search and a time to give up, a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to tear and a time to mend, a time to be silent and a time to speak, a time to love, a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. Besides the practical character of this, as he specifies these things, I think that there's an overall meaning to the idea that there is a time for everything, as he introduces this, and a season for every activity under heaven. Sometimes things are best unsaid because of the situation, because of the people present, because of the topic that you're thinking of. Sometimes it's just the best thing to keep your mouth shut. Sometimes, on the other hand, it's the best thing to speak out. And the discretion that we use in trying to make those kinds of choices is very, very important. We are told in Proverbs numbers of times that we're to guard our words. Watch out about what you say. Sometimes what we say about people or to people has a great effect just simply on our relationship to these people. Sometimes there are things that are poorly said or not well thought out break friendships or injure other people. Or sometimes we find out that those things are really not true that we thought because we didn't stop and take time to analyze and think. We need to stop and consider the fact that there is a time for everything. And then over in Ecclesiastes 5, beginning with verse 10, he gives us some things about wealth and riches. First of all, there isn't anything wrong with riches. There's not anything wrong with being wealthy. There's not anything wrong with acquiring wealth, unless, of course, we do that in an illegal or unethical way. But the idea that he has here in these verses is that the love of money can be so absorbing to us. Let's read just a little bit of that. Whoever loves money never has money enough. Whoever loves wealth is never satisfied with his income. He said this too is meaningless. When we love money and pursue it, it turns out to be meaningless. As goods increase, so do those who consume them. And what benefit are they to the owner, except to feast his eyes on them? There are so many good things that the author says here about the whole idea of pursuing wealth. And the reason that I chose this particular one was that we live in a culture that is absorbed by the idea of wealth. Wealth is all right, but when we allow the desire for wealth to guide our lives, we end up doing some terrible, terrible things. We end up putting ourselves in some very difficult positions, difficult situations. And, you've heard the expression, money is the root of all evil. The Bible never says that. Did you know that? What does the Bible say about it? The love of money. How much money do you have to love money? None. Exactly. None. And yet the acquiring of wealth so absorbed our culture that people lie, cheat, and steal and do all kinds of things and kill each other for sums of money. And so the thing that he's talking about here in this passage is the idea that if money is that important to us, then money is in the wrong list of priorities. Well, we can go on in the book of Ecclesiastes over to the 7th chapter and the 9th verse. Here he says, do not be quickly provoked in your spirit, for anger resides in the lap of fools. I like that one. I guess the reason I like that is that I am one to get angry, and I have to control this. And this speaks to me. This says something to me that's very, very important to me. The idea here is just simply that one who gets angry easily, one who at the drop of a hat will judge another person, become angry at another person, or at another institution, or another business. When we do that, we really lose a great deal of ground. Quite a while ago, I told you a story in my own life, and I'm going to tell it again because I believe that it fits right into this. When we were living in Tampa, Florida, back in the 50s, my watch broke. It was a wind-up watch. We didn't have electronic watches in those days, and so I took it to a jeweler, and he cleaned it and fixed it and so forth, gave it back to me. And the first thing you know, just within a day or two, it was doing the same thing. So I took it back, and he said, "Well, I'll fix it again. Won't charge you anything. I'm sorry that this happened." But he says, "I'll tell you, it's going to take me about 2 weeks to get to it." I could have been real mad. I could have said, "Wait a minute, you've already had it one time." You know, all kinds of things I could have said to him. And I said, "That's okay. I understand that there are other people you have to serve." He looked at me, he's so surprised, and he said, "Mr. Burch, I'll have it for you tomorrow." The idea is not, well, it isn't that I was such a great person in controlling my anger then at that time, but it is this. It is that when we allow anger to control us, we lose. Be angry, Paul said, and sin not, in Ephesians. Let not the sun go down on your wrath. And so the message here that is so terribly important for us is don't jump to conclusions. Jumping to conclusions almost always makes us angry because those conclusions are almost always things that we don't like. So don't jump to conclusions because you're just opening the door then for anger to come in. Don't speak without first thinking. Well, people say, "Well, I just said that before I thought." Well, you've been thinking back behind that. That usually has to do with the fact that we have built up in us sometime an angry attitude, and somebody just sets it off, and then we say things that we don't mean to say. We wish we hadn't said. "Oh, I spoke before I thought." But this is something that has been building up in us. There was a man that I knew one time. He and his wife were having a great deal of trouble, and he came into the church office and he began talking about himself. And he recognized that he was a man of great anger, and he told me so. He says, "I live a life of being angry at people, and I just can't control this." Well, we talked about that, and I said, "Well, give me an idea of what you're talking about." He said, "Jack, I can see a man on a corner across the street, and I can just have a terrible desire to go over there and punch him in the nose. And I don't even know this fella." Well, you see, this is the kind of anger that a person now allows to control him. And to a lesser degree, we're all guilty of this same type thing. Of course, as I was as I was thinking about this lesson, I thought of the song, Angry Words. And so I just wrote down the words. Angry words, oh, let them never from the tongue unbridled slip. May the heart's best impulse ever check them ere they soil the lips. Love is much too pure and holy. Friendship is too sacred far for a moment's reckless folly thus to desolate and mar. Angry words are lightly spoken, bitterest thoughts are rashly stirred. Brightest links of life are broken by a single angry word. And then the chorus is, love one another, thus saith the Savior. Children, obey the Father's blessed commands. Love one another, thus saith the Savior. Children, obey the blessed command. The writer of that song certainly had these things in mind that we just read from Ecclesiastes and some from Proverbs. Ecclesiastes 9:17, the quiet words of the wise are more to be heeded than the shouts of the ruler of fools. It isn't the person who shouts the loudest who has the best things to say. It isn't the person who controls the conversation who necessarily has the best advice for all of us. Well, let's take a look at the book of Proverbs then for just a moment. We'll go back to that Proverbs chapter 1. Respect for God. Proverbs 1:7, the fear of God is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and discipline. Why is it that we have so many people who are involved in crime? Why is it that we have gangs that are involved in crime? Gangs many times of teenagers. Well, one of the reasons is that they have not been reared in the fear of the Lord. The word fear has a double meaning in the Bible. Sometimes it's fear of the wrath of God. And I think that's a pretty healthy fear. It isn't the fear of some kind of a pseudo or false idea or something that doesn't exist. That's psychosis. But it's fear of the wrath of God because I know that that wrath is well placed. And so the Bible teaches that we ought to fear the wrath of God. But then the word fear is also used in reference to respect for God as a powerful creator. Respect for God because he is God. And it's very unfortunate that there are so many people in our culture who don't have this kind of respect. When political things come up, many times people will go with whatever they want politically. When moral things come up in reference to political things, whatever I want morally, that's the thing that I will go for, without giving consideration to, wait a minute, does the Bible have something to say about this? Did God tell us something about what ought to be and what ought not to be? The Supreme Court made, in my opinion, and I don't mean to be a lawyer, but it made a very terrible decision, in my opinion, when they okayed same-sex marriage nationwide. I'm not sure what the Constitution, how that would control it or anything like this, but people don't stop to consider what the Bible says about this thing unless they're being called bigots or you can't push your morality off on me. That's your morality, that's not my morality. That's God's morality that we're talking about. And so this idea of gaining insight and discernment, the basis of right and wrong, these things are so very important in our culture. And so much of the time, these things are trampled upon. I remember some time ago, and I wrote down the date of this statement, but I remember some time ago, it was last year, Bill Maher made some terrible, terrible statements on TV. He said, "Who drowned babies? Who is a mass murderer? And he goes on and gives a big long list of things that God had done. And he said, well, I'll tell you who it is. It's God. His name is God. And he went on a big tirade about this. I heard this on TV. This isn't something just reported. This is something that I heard myself. And I just thought to myself, if we have a generation of people who feel that way about God, folks, we're in trouble. We're in big trouble in our nation, in the church, in our business, in our families. Then there's another statement that we find in Proverbs chapter 2, verses 1 through 6. Here he says, my son, if you accept my words and store up my commandments within you, turning your ear to wisdom and applying your heart to understanding, you will call for, and if you call for insight and cry aloud for understanding, and if you look for it, listen to this, if you look for it as for gold and search for it as a hidden treasure, then you will understand the fear of the Lord and find the knowledge of God. For the Lord gives wisdom, and from his mouth come knowledge and understanding. Now there's a group of interesting words right here that are used in this and in other passages. The ordinary Greek word for knowledge is the Greek word gnosis. In the Greek translation of the Old Testament that came about in the 2nd century BC, that's called the Septuagint, and it's the Old Testament in Greek. And it's kind of interesting that sometime when the word knowledge is used, it's a word that we use, that we would say use for insight, understanding, not just knowledge in and of itself, but insight into what this really, the idea that really carries in itself. And that's the very thing that took place here. And then when he uses the word wisdom, he doesn't use the word gnosis, knowledge. He uses the word Sophia. And by the way, that's one reason that on the announcement that I sent out, I had the statue of the Greek goddess Sophia. There were two Greek goddesses of knowledge, of wisdom rather, and one was Sophia and the other was Athena. And the idea of wisdom among the Greeks was very, very important. And that isn't necessarily knowledge. It's a word that we get sophisticated from. It's understanding something so that we can do something with it. And it's understanding something so that in the biblical text, so that it helps us to become better people. Proverbs chapter 3, verses 5 through 7. Trust the Lord with all of your heart. Lean not on your understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your path straight. Really a good statement, I think. One is the acknowledgement of God. We live in a time when if you acknowledge God, you can't say that in schools now. You can't say that in public assemblies, in many public assemblies anyway, you can't talk about God. And the whole idea was that Israel as a nation, they were called on to constantly acknowledge God as their God. And partly because of a violation of that, they moved farther and farther away from God. Chapter 3, verses 11 and 12. My son, do not despise the Lord's discipline, and do not resent his rebuke, because the Lord disciplines those he loves, as a father the son he delights in. So, I can remember when I was growing up, when I did things wrong, I was punished for it. And I cannot remember a single time that I ever enjoyed that punishment. That just was not the way things were. And my parents were spanking parents. And I remember some spankings that I received. And I also remember that when I did something that was real bad, my mother would say, I'm not going to whip you, but I'm going to tell your father about it. That was the worst news I could get. That was bad news, really. Now, my parents were not in the least bit abusive. Not do this in retaliation in any way. But the point of the whole thing is that God teaches us by discipline. Sometimes God teaches us the best things for us are when we lose something, when something is taken away from us, when something that is very dear to me is taken away from me. The death of a spouse, the death of a child, the death of a close friend, the death of someone who has meant a great deal to you, that hurts. But if we look at it simply with resentment, we will not get the message that can come from such things as that. The messages will be a wide variety of things. But the point is that when bad times come, let's see what we can do with those bad times. When bad events take place, let's see how we can learn from those bad events. And so I think that's the idea. Do not despise the discipline of the Lord. Whom he loves, he chastens. And this is quoted, by the way, in the New Testament as well. Well, there's a work ethic that I like. This is one of my favorite passages in the entire book of Proverbs. It's in the 6th chapter of Proverbs, verses 6 through 11. And some of you already know what that's going to mean, I believe. Go to the ant, you sluggard. Consider her ways and be wise. It has no commander, no overseer or ruler, and yet it stores its provision in the summer and gathers its food in the harvest. How long will you lie there, you sluggard? When will you get up from your sleep? A little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest, and poverty will come to you like a bandit, and scarcity like an armed man. Ants are very interesting. I guess they do these things by instinct. I really don't know how big the brain of an ant is and how that ant is going to be able to reason things out. I can't imagine an ant saying to himself, well, let's see, winter's coming. I better get to work here and gather some food in. No, I don't think it's that at all. I think they do that by instinct. But the point is, they are not ruled over and forced to do this. They do it because it's right and good and needed. And so when the writer here, Solomon, is talking about the ants, he makes the application. Now, you who are lazy, you who won't work, you who try to find every excuse for not working or doing a slouchy job, he says, listen to me. The ant, this is really bad to say, the ant has better sense than you have. In that little brain, that ant has better sense than you have. Has no ruler, has no boss, has no overseer. But the ant puts the food away so that food will be there when food is needed. Notice that he does that by instinct. Ecclesiastes, let me go back to Ecclesiastes for just one of these. Whatever your hand finds to do, do it with all your might. Ecclesiastes 9:10. In our work, can we get by? I remember when I was a little boy, my mom sent me out to rake up the leaves in the yard. I hated to rake up leaves. I still don't like it. And I went out there and I raked things up, and it was a pretty sloppy job. And I came back in, she says, have you finished? I said, yeah, I'm finished. She said, let me go look. I thought, oh, good night. You know, I don't want her to see what I did. She went out there and she said, you feel like this is a good job? Yeah, that's a good job, Mom. Well, all right, if you feel like it's a good job, come on in. Well, I knew it was a bad job, and I guess I was, 5 years old, 6 years old when this happened, and it's always stuck with me. The thing that he's really talking about here is just the simple fact that what we what we find necessary and needed to do, work, family, friendships, whatever it is, whatever we find, is do a good job of it. So you can sit back and look at that thing and say, I did that, you know. I remember a carpenter that I knew down in New Orleans, and he was talking about the pride that he took in his work. He said, Jack, it's not very much, but when I hang a door, and I close it, it locks, and it doesn't rattle or anything like that. He said, literally, I sit back and just kind of say to myself, I did that. Take pride in your work. That's certainly the idea. Well, let me just read a few, and without comment, and then we'll be dismissed. Proverbs 11:22. This absolutely is one of my favorites because I think it's so funny. Like a gold ring in a pig's snout is a beautiful woman who shows no discretion. Proverbs 12, verse 1. Whoever loves discipline loves knowledge, but he who hates correction is stupid. Proverbs 12:9. Better to be a nobody and yet have a servant than to pretend to be somebody and have no food. Isn't that a good one? Chapter 12, verse 18. Reckless words pierce like a sword, but the tongue of the wise brings healing. Chapter 12, verse 22. The Lord detests lying lips, but he delights in men who are truthful. 28:9. He who turns away his ear from hearing the law, even his prayer is an abomination. So I can pray and God be so displeased with me that he considers it an abomination if I turn my ear away from hearing the law. Well, there's a list. This is a list of very practical things, I think. It tells us something about what life is about and how we can improve life. No, they don't work every time. That isn't their idea. But the idea is certainly this, that practicing these ethical rules, these rules for respect for God, and all of these other things that we've talked about, putting those things into our lives makes us better people. It assures us of stronger personal relationships. It gives us confidence in ourselves and in the future. We're going to sing an invitation song. If you're in any way subject to the invitation of Christ, you're invited to come. Let's stand together and sing, please.